Wonderful. Thank you so much, Heather, for your setup of all of this. I'm going to try and, uh, there I am, get me so I can see what I'm doing here. Welcome to A Gardener's Guide to Planting Bulbs for Brilliant Results. It's a great time of year to be thinking about bulbs, as we imagine you are if you're signing in over your lunch hour today to talk or to listen to us, but also to talk with us too about bulbs. As Heather said, we will take questions throughout the program. I do not have a formal lecture today with slides, and instead we're going to shake it up a little bit and do some demonstrations. So I have some bulbs in front of me, and we're going to walk through some things, and then we're going to do a demo at the end of our time together today about planting bulbs in containers, because bulbs in containers is something that I don't know that maybe many of us are doing, and more of us should be, because it's really easy and it has a lot of benefits. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. I wanted to start off first, though, with just a couple of things in general about bulbs in the garden. Obviously, it's a great time to be thinking about bulb planting. Heather gave a well-intended promo for our fall bulb and perennial market, and that 50% off perennials that are going on right now. That's the containerized perennials that we launched there about 6 weeks ago. We have just some few things left, and we're trying to sort of clean the house on that. But while you're in there, we hope you're taking a look too at all of the bulbs that we have available. We put together a nice selection this year of tulips and daffodils and a whole array of other bulbs. And we are doing really well on that sale, and really appreciate your support if you've already purchased those things. And of course, the pickup for those fall bulbs is next weekend. So when we started that sales event, we decided we probably, around the time pickup would happen, wanted to do one of these little kind of lunch and learn sessions on bulbs. And so that's why we're here doing what we're doing today. So it is really now probably, when you come to pick up your bulbs next weekend, from, the day you pick them up, really now until the ground freezes up, is a good time to plant bulbs. And so you may be, if you're like me, sometimes you order bulbs in the spring when you're really excited about bulbs, because you're seeing them in flower and you're seeing the spots in your garden where you don't have them. That's one of the first tips I'd offer you today, is that actually the best planting you can do for fall bulb planting is actually in the spring, when you see the bulbs that you have. In fact, when I do designs and when we do plantings, we don't always put bulbs in the very first year. We'd like to sometimes wait until the second year, so that way we can really start to see the plants, the perennials and the annuals and the shrubs and whatever we've used in our design really come into their form a little bit in that first year, and then start to imagine going through that first spring, maybe where those pockets of spring color or that sort of thread of new growth should be incorporated into the design, both aesthetically as well as functionally, figuring out, where we kind of hide the bulbs, because of course they're really beautiful when they flower, but they have that sort of senescence period they go through, which is not always so attractive. So how do we choreograph the plantings so that the perennials kind of come in and hide the fading foliage of the bulbs as they start to go into their dormancy for the summer and fall? So all that said, we've been thinking here at the Botanical Garden about fall planted bulbs for months now. I encourage people to go out with their cell phone or a real camera, and just in the spring, snap shots of your garden and look at where maybe you've had bulbs in the past. Most of us aren't usually starting a garden from scratch. We're inheriting the bones of a landscape around a house that we either are buying, or maybe that we've been gardening at for some time. And so, we've got bulbs in places, we've got all kinds of stuff going on. And sometimes it's good to put it in a frame and take a capture with a camera of some kind, and really start to go, I need a little more yellow there. I need a few more tulips there. I need something just to connect the dots a little bit more. And then that allows us to start planning and getting our feet wet about how many bulbs we'll need come fall. And it leads to a little more thoughtful, intentional planting than the impulsiveness that you and I as plant geeks are sometimes inclined to do. So that a couple of my first tips there about just sort of how to think about planting and bringing bulbs into the garden. Another thing about layering too, and we'll talk a little bit about layering when we get to our container demonstration here a little bit later, is that, just like all the other perennials that we layer together into the garden, bulbs really fit into that very well, because not only are there just a great array of bulbs that we can grow here in the Midwest, there's also a great array of bloom times, from the earliest snowdrops and crocus that come up at the end of the winter into early spring, to things like the crowned fritillaries, and even tuberous things like or rootstocks like peonies that we also plant this time of the year, into late spring into early summer. There's a lot of things that we can choose from. And so we thinking about, again, where to put those in the garden so that they emerge and do their thing and then quietly go to sleep while the next layer comes in is something to be mindful of a little bit as we start to learn more about plants and their architectures and how we put them together. So we don't have to think about the dying foliage as much as the new things that are coming in to replace them. So again, your photography can help with that a little bit too, because you can think about those almost at the same time. You can think, well, I need some more bulb color in this particular spot, but if that's a very open spot at the front of the bed or the border, you'll want to think about what sort of hides that as those bulbs start to come down. And that's often, summer blooming perennials that are just starting to come up. And so they're not really competing with spring flowering bulbs at that early window. But by the time they really get going, they sort of trade places and kind of move out of the display at the same time. So just a couple of things to be kind of thinking about as you're choosing bulbs for the garden. I wanted to actually then show you some examples of bulbs that maybe you've ordered already or that you'll pick up next weekend, because we say bulbs, but if I put my botanical plant instructor hat on here for a minute, not all of the bulbs that we plant are technically bulbs, and this is more than just trivial knowledge. It actually is important to understand these structures a little bit because it tells you a little bit about what to do with them and how to plant them and how to garden and grow these plants over time. So I mentioned crocus out front because, of course, crocus are one of those harbingers of spring alongside the snowdrops and the winter aconites, the first little glimmers of spring that we start to see as the winter recedes and the spring comes into the window. Whenever that happens in Iowa, it can be as early as February some years, or it can be as late as the 1st of April. Crocuses are unique in that we often think of them as bulbs. And here's an example of one. They're quite small. I'm going to maybe put a few in my hand so you can see. We'll hold them up here. You see, they're quite small. I mean, they're maybe no more than just a quarter in size, or comparatively about the size of a quarter. And they have this little kind of papery covering, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Believe it or not, crocuses are actually related to irises. And because of, well, we'll talk about irises in just a minute. Because of that, they are not actually truly bulbs. They're called corms. So they are like gladiolas in that way. They're also in the same family as gladiolas. A corm is kind of like a bulb. It's still a storage organ, all things considered, but it's kind of a compressed stem where all of this swollen tissue that kind of looks like a bulb is actually modified stem tissue. At the end of the day, regardless of all of these terms, the point is that this whole group of plants, which has evolved at different times in different places in different parts of the world, so they don't have necessarily a common ancestor just because they have a structure like this. They have evolved because this is the way in which they have adapted to the environments that they've been present in for many millions of years. And so these kind of compressed or modified stems that occur under the ground are a way then of storing reserves. But anything that is a bulb, generally that gives us a clue about its life cycle, because a bulb or a corm, in the case of the crocus here that I was just showing, really is like a little energy packet. It has all this sort of energy, these reserves, these starches and things that it's storing inside of this corm to produce one floral display a year. And that's really important to know, because in a crocus, for example, there's essentially one or a few flower beds in each of these exceptions. I'm generalizing a little bit because we're going to talk about a lot of different things. But generally speaking, there's essentially one set of flowers that happens on an annual cycle. And so that cycle happens, as those bulbs, stay in your garden over many years. Their job is to grow throughout the season after they're done blooming, to take photosynthesize and take in those reserves, to store them all up so that they can come in the next year in the garden and bloom again. And then they repeat that cycle. So it's a very often, with all bulbs, there's just a very abbreviated period, of bulbs and bulb-like structures. There's a very abbreviated period in which they flower. Whether that's, and then there are fall blooming bulbs, of course, the fall crocuses, the colchicums that are flowering now or have been flowering for the last few weeks. So it's not just to say, oh, this always happens in the spring. Again, it's just a floral display that happens once in the whole calendar year of the growing season for that plant. So corms, that's a bulb-like structure that's really more about a modified stem, and that's sort of swollen. You can think about, taking a cylinder that would be much taller and sort of cramming it down just below the surface of the soil and putting all of that energy right into that little thing right there. We're going to talk about the size of bulbs too, because the size of a bulb doesn't immediately tell you, or a bulb-like structure, doesn't immediately tell you anything about whether it's healthy or whether it's good or whether any, I mean, it's a ratio, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And it also gives us a clue for how deep to plant things. So again, we're getting it. Now let's talk about true bulbs for a minute. And let's talk, for example, about an onion, an allium. Many of the alliums that we enjoy as flowers in the garden are just really cousins of the onions that we put in soups and that we chop up and saute for all sorts of things. And so the genus allium is substantial in size, maybe 1,000 species or so around the whole world. And alliums like Allium schubertii, which you've probably seen at the garden because it's this wonderful, the picture may not show up very well, but it's that fireworks display that we love in places like the rose garden and the cane garden that is about 12 inches tall, and right down there at the base of the ground, somewhere around the end of May, there's just this explosion of those kind of little pinkish flowers, but it's really it's that whole head that sort of persists. And sometimes we paint them and do silly things with them because we're just out there having fun. And that's one of the great things about alliums like that, is that their structures, their seed heads really persist for a long time, and even sometimes into the winter. I just cut some down in my own garden the other day because they were sort of in the way of something else I was planting, but I was marveling how they've withstood the entire summer, months at a time, and they're still standing straight up and down. Alliums and tulips, like we're going to talk about next, are true bulbs. So unlike the corms that we talked about a minute ago, which are modified stems, bulbs are a little bit different in that the tissue that stores all that energy that we were just talking about is actually in the form of these modified leaves. And Heather, I'm realizing I didn't grab a knife, and I should have, just to show this, but if you've ever sliced an onion in half, you see all those little layers, right? I mean, all those just sort of layers of things, all the way down to that little center piece. Each of those is a modified leaf, believe it or not. And it's in those modified leaves, buried all the way under the ground, that there is this energy which gets stored, again, on an annual basis that supports one floral display in a growing season cycle. Now, at the bottom of a bulb is what is called the basal plate. And I'm going to try to show that so you can see that. You can see these little tufts of roots that are coming right out of the basal plate. And that's bottom side down, pointy side up here, right? If you're new to bulbs and you're like, what are all these things he's talking about? Pointy side goes up. Because here's the deal. On corms, you'll notice, in fact, that that's a pretty different looking bottom than something like an onion. There really aren't generally little root protrusions there at the bottom, but there is kind of a clear pointy end that should go up. But we'll get to all that in a minute. I don't want to overwhelm you with project, but little tuft, basal plate, series of modified leaves. In true botanical trivia, this is called a tunicate bulb because it has this kind of papery covering on it, as many onions do, that we peel off before we cut them down in the kitchen. Not all bulbs are like that. In fact, I had Leslie Hunter, our senior horticulturist that works in the rose garden and the cane garden. I asked her this morning, I said, would you mind going out and pulling up a lily for me so I can show our friends this afternoon an example of a bulb that's not a tunicate bulb, but it is a true bulb. And this gives you, I think, a way in which you can see. I wore a white shirt today, which is probably dangerous being around all these bulbs in this dirt. But so you would see against a background here exactly what these structures look like. So this lily's obviously still growing. It's going into dormancy. This is a fine time of year, by the way, to be dividing bulbs like lilies. It's a good time of year to plant. Even though a lot of garden centers don't sell them until the spring, it's really better to plant them here now in the fall. Because oftentimes when you've bought them in the spring, they've just simply been dug in the fall and then sat in a cooler for 6 months. And so you're really getting a better quality product if you buy them now and plant them now, and you're really getting them established faster and more likely to see flowers sooner than if you would wait till later in the spring. It's not necessarily good or bad, it's just a little bit better to plant them in the fall. And we do have lilies for sale as part of our fall bulb and perennial market, some really lovely lilies, by the way, and I hope you'll check them out. So you can kind of see here, this obviously is stem. I mean, that's where it flowered and did its business earlier in the season, but you see each of these little pieces, these scales that we call them, are actually modified leaves, and that's where all of that energy is stored that supports this great floral display that happens. In fact, if I can peel this off, there we go. You see that if you can peel that scale off actually. It kind of does when you hold it in your hand like that, it's like, oh, it kind of does look like a weird leaf. It's almost succulent in nature, but it's really at this point an underground leaf that's storing all of this, all these reserves that are helping to produce this floral display. And then you can see where I broke that off, kind of right at the end of my index finger there, kind of the point of connection where that connects to the basal plate. So anyway, great time of year to be dividing bulbs, but you hold this up and you hold the allium up and you think, okay, well, I mean, they sort of are both underground and they're both storing things, but they're sort of pretty different just in terms of the structures. This doesn't have that papery covering, whereas the allium does. So thanks to Leslie for digging those up for us so we could take a look at those. And again, check out the few lilies that we do have in the sale, because there are plenty of them left, and people love lilies when they come to the garden. And again, a great reminder of a bulb that is not a spring flowering bulb, but in fact is a summer flowering bulb. You can usually set your watch around the botanical garden grounds around mid to late June, when the oriental and trumpet lilies and their hybrids, the orientet lilies, begin to flower and perfume the garden so heavenly. It just hangs on the air on a humid July night around the 4th of July, when they're really all at a sort of spectacular apex. It's really quite something. On to tulips. We have to talk about tulips, because what would spring be without something as classic as a tulip? Now, lots of different kinds of tulips, so many different kinds of tulips. There's all these classifications. The same is true of daffodils. There's lots of different kinds, there's lots of different classifications. We're not going to cover all of that today. You can find that on the internet if you are so inclined. But I want to share with you a couple of things about tulips, because we all know tulips. We can buy tulips any time of the year we want, and in the floral display case at Hy-Vee or Gateway Market if we want. But the thing about tulips in the garden, there's kind of two categories, if you really want to think about it, gardener to gardener, of tulips in the garden. One are the true perennial tulips, tulips that you can plant once and that will come back year after year after year. At the farm where I started gardening when I was a kid, my parents' farm, I have tulips like one of these species tulips, Tulipa clusiana, that I've had in the same place in one of my gravel gardens there for nearly 15 years. And doing just fine. They come up every year, they flower, they're great. And those are great varieties to look at if you really want to have a perennial tulip that you can just rely on, and they're really tough. They like good drainage, so if you have a gravel garden or a space that maybe you have a little sandier soil, they're great for those applications. But they do okay in normal garden soil as well too. It's not going to preclude you from growing them. But of course, a lot of bulbs in general actually really need pretty good drainage. There's relatively few bulbs that have evolved in places in the world where there is a high level of soil moisture. There's certainly exceptions, but the vast majority of bulbs need good drainage. And our Iowa topsoil provides plenty of drainage for a good many bulb species. So I don't want you to think there's some rarefied list that you have to look for. But it's just a good example. If you have heavy clay, it's going to limit the number of things you can really grow. And for any of you out there who hear me talk about my home garden, Free Oaks, you know that I have very heavy clay. We can talk about that just a little bit later too. And I'm happy to answer questions as we pop up again along the way. So, here a minute ago, I showed you, I said, this is a tulip, and you're like, wow, that's a pretty small tulip compared to what you might be used to thinking about. This is this little species tulip again, a great number of them available in the fall bulb and perennial market, and they come in a great array of colors, quite frankly, everything from sort of lavenders and whites, even white with big blue spots on them, all the way to yellows and reds and oranges and all kinds of things. So there's that. Now, maybe the more gregarious tulips that we are used to gardening with in our gardens are these much later flowering tulips. Varieties like one we particularly like, an old variety. It's been around for decades, really, and called Angelique. Great kind of double later flowering tulip. And so even outside of the species tulips, which tend to bloom a little bit earlier in tulip season, although again there's some exceptions. Some bloom fairly late, but a vast majority of them are the first out of the gate when it comes to tulips. And so these taller ones, again, the great many colors, varieties, singles, lily flowers, parrots, double lates, all these, all these choices out there for you as gardeners. And we try to represent a nice sort of kaleidoscope of those in the market that we have going on right now. And so, and it's kind of a Duke's mixture of sorts, because we chose varieties that we have good luck with in displays. You probably have seen the displays that we do in the entry garden, as well as along the espaliered wall in the cane garden, as well as on the Belvedere. These are big mixes of tulips that we custom design every year, and we get big wheelbarrows out and dump them all in like we're cooking and mixing our dry ingredients around. And probably just in about the next couple of weeks, because the bulbs are coming in right now, we'll start that effort of pulling up the displays from the summer and preparing the soil and getting the bulbs in for the next season. And so the thing about tulips to be mindful of, I said there were two categories, right? There's like the ones that are really perennial and that come back, and then there's ones that are kind of just for show. And we've typically chosen varieties that are in the market that fall into the first category, things that are good perennializers. But not all tulips are created equal in that way, and that's fine. We're not making a judgment about it. You well know that places like Pella do these vast displays, and really, in a micro way, like the ones, a micro version of those are what we do here. We let them do their thing, and then we rip them out and throw them away. And some people think, oh my gosh, you're throwing away all these tulips. But the reality is that a vast array of modern tulip hybrids have really been bred and developed to be annuals. They are not, in fact, good perennializers, and they're kind of like candy. You chew through it and you get a sugar high, and it's over with. And that's fine. We think that's just fine. Not everything has to last forever in that way too. Now, Angelique is an example of a great perennial tulip. I planted the first tulip bulbs of Angelique at my parents' farm when I was probably 10 or 11 years old, with allowance money that I'm sure I spent at Lowe's or Home Depot or somewhere, and bought them in bulk and took them home. And I still have Angelique, not maybe all of them that I planted all those years ago, but I still have Angelique in the garden at the farm. It's still there after all those many years. So, real testament to that first category of perennial bulbs, as opposed to maybe some of the more fanciful tulips, things like parrots, the parrot type tulips, some of the green tulips, the viridiflora types. Some of these just are not, going to hang around for 1 or 2 years. And so I just want to say that, so I just what you're kind of getting into. And it varies by garden. This is a very loose classification, but I will say that if you've shopped on the market, we've tended to choose tulips that fall into that perennial category. All that said, if you've bought other tulips elsewhere and you're not sure, I'm going to give you a strategy for how to use tulips and truly treat them as these kinds of annual displays that you can use in containers and in places where it doesn't take you a lot of time or effort to really just tuck them in and enjoy them for what they are, even if that's just a relatively brief few weeks in the spring. So I've gone through all my, I've got one more thing here too, because, earlier, and then we'll get to the planting demo, and we'll get our hands dirty a little bit here. Earlier in the fall, along with the perennials, we were selling bearded irises. And it's also dahlia season too. It's one of the great things about fall, early fall here at the Botanical Garden, is that we really get to enjoy that last great hurrah of our growing season, which is dahlias. Leslie Hunter loves dahlias. We all love dahlias. But Leslie really makes a point every year to grow beautiful displays of dahlias in the cane garden and the espaliered wall, training them up on either bamboo stakes, or this year we got kind of creative and we used copper pipe, so we have something a little more decorative than just a green stick of bamboo, to tie them up and grow them nice and tall so we can get beautiful showy flowers of dahlias. And so if you have dahlias, you're going to probably soon be digging them up to make sure that they don't get frosted and lose them. But I'll tell you, most dahlias can go through at least one frost. In fact, you kind of want them to, so you kind of knock all that foliage down. So you think, well, okay, now I know what a corm is and what a bulb is, and what about rhizomes and tubers? What are those? You've heard tuber because of a potato, and you've heard me say before, if you've heard me talk about irises, that bearded irises are not bulbs, in fact, but that are rhizomes. And so that's sort of, again, another kind of modified stem that's growing, instead of these other ones sort of way below the ground, is really more or less growing at ground level. And that's an important thing to keep a little note about, is that bulbs and corms and those kinds of structures are subterranean. I mean, they're underground structures. Rhizomes and tubers tend to be structures that you plant at a much shallower depth, and if not in the case of bearded irises, right at the soil level. I'll never forget many years ago when I was a teenager and my family and I had just started our iris nursery. I was giving a presentation here in Des Moines for a garden show. I was talking about irises and bulbs and all kinds of things to, create a beautiful display of these kinds of plants in your garden. And a woman came up to me after the talk with a somewhat mortified look on her face, which I tried not to take personally. And she said, well, I planted almost 100 bearded irises last fall, but somebody told me they were bulbs. And so I planted them all 8 inches deep, which is not how you plant irises or even dahlias for that matter. Rhizomes and tubers really need to be shallow and very close to the surface of the soil. Bulbs are deeper, they're different. And so she was right. If it was a bulb, she should have planted it pretty deep. And we'll talk about that here in a minute when we get the pot out. However, for rhizomes, like bearded irises and dahlias and other things, planting them 8 inches deep is a bit of a death sentence, and they just won't recover. I mean, they just don't have the energy to push through all of that soil to get out. And then further, the structure isn't designed to do that, and so they'll often rot and they just won't persist. And so anyway, here's what a dahlia looks like. We didn't clean it up. We just pulled it out of the garden fresh this morning. Now, this is a first-year plant, so this isn't a very big tuber as dahlias go, all things considered. I'm going to hold the leaves up there so you can kind of see it against my white shirt. It's sort of a strange-looking structure, but you can kind of see again. It's this sort of swollen, almost stem-like structure, kind of maybe something quite a bit more stem-like here than this particular side. But this sort of energy, like a potato, that starchiness inside, if we were to cut it open, is what ultimately will give rise to the flowers the following season. So, at the end of the day, whether you're planting bulbs or tubers or rhizomes or corms or what have you, they're all doing the same thing functionally, and that they're providing energy to carry that floral display through from year to year. Okay, enough of the basics of what's the difference between all of this sort of stuff. I'm going to pull up our camera over here next to me, and we set up a little demo here to walk through because, again, planting bulbs in containers is something I don't think enough people do, and I think we should do more of it, quite frankly, because it is so easy to do and it is so rewarding. Now, you may think, well, if I've got this really big garden, why would I ever bother putting bulbs in a pot? I've got all these bulbs to plant in the ground. And that may be true. I fell into that category probably myself for a long period of time. I've never had a garden in my life without bulbs, and I plant bulbs every year. If you've gardened in the same place for more than about 10 years, you quickly realize by year 12 and 15, you can't put the shovel in the ground because you keep finding the bulbs you planted 10 years ago. And I'm definitely at that place in the garden at the farm where I've been planting bulbs since 1998, and so I just have stuffed them in wherever I can find them. But I love that richness and that fullness of flowers early in the season. It just gets my engines going for gardening, so I have to do it. But not all bulbs, of course, get planted at the same depth. You can imagine that a corm like a crocus probably isn't going to go at the same depth as a tulip. And one easy rule, so you don't have to memorize all these depths of how deep do I plant this or what do I do with this. One easy thing to sort of remember about bulbs is that you plant them generally about 3 times as deep as their width. So that's a really handy rule. Again, you plant bulbs at a depth 3 times their width. And so you can kind of see pretty quickly then how a much smaller circumference like a crocus might only go about 3 or 4 inches deep, whereas something like a tulip needs to really be at a minimum of about 6 inches, sometimes even closer to 8, depending on the size of the tulip or the grade of the bulb that you buy. Now, for many bulbs like tulips and daffodils, and I didn't ignore daffodils today, we just are getting our first shipments of them in today, so I didn't have one handy to show you. For these kinds of bulbs, deeper is really better. And I understand, believe me, that can be something of a pain. If you already have an existing garden and lots of things going on, it's a challenge to figure out how to get an 8-inch hole in between all of these other things, particularly if you've bought 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 bulbs and trying to find all these sort of holes can be a little disruptive, certainly. I certainly appreciate that and get that, believe me. And heavier soils, it's a real chore to get that depth just right. You know, are they going to throw an absolute fit if it's 5 or 6 inches versus 7 or 8 inches? Probably not. But if it is a variety, in the case of a tulip, that is not necessarily the best perennializer, it will probably fade away from the garden more quickly at a shallower depth than it will at a deeper placement. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. So I'm demonstrating here how to plant in a container, but in many ways I'm demonstrating just how to plant them, period. But if you're interested in trying this with me, I bought a bunch. I'm going to do it was the first day of the bulb market. I bought all of my tulips. I'm super excited. I've got a color scheme, and it's going to be this kind of orangey thing. I love orange in the spring because it's so unexpected and it fires you up and all that. So I've got a whole array of terracotta pots and some other pots as well too. But I'm using a terracotta pot here to demonstrate this. A couple of things to know about planting bulbs in containers. A container is not equivalent to the ground. Some of the same rules apply, but a lot of them need some caveats because, you know, a pot, like a terracotta pot, isn't nearly as good at insulating the soil volume and the bulbs in it as the native soil in your backyard. Our native soils are a much more complicated living network of things that are just existing over, you know, hundreds and thousands of square miles in continuousness between bedrock and all this other stuff. I mean, so they just do a much better job of insulating like a big dirt sandwich around all of these bulbs. So one of the things in order to account for that, if you are going to plant bulbs in containers in particular, especially tulips, and I'll come back to why that's true, you want to get a pot that's not only wide enough, but also deep enough. So you probably can't see it exactly, but this is about a 15-inch diameter container. So it's 15 inches, you know, kind of around the diameter of the top of the container, not the bottom, 15 inches across the top. I would not use anything less than this in diameter. In fact, I actually, when I picked this up out of the head house this morning, I thought, oh, that looks about 18 inches. And then I got my tape measure out, it was only about 15. So I always, it's nice to have one of these handy because the wider that you can get that pot, the more insulating volume of soil that you can get. Now, the same application applies for its depth. So this is about an 18-inch deep container and 15 inches wide. So the point here is you can't just use any small container you might have sitting around with that you might have annuals or a smaller array of specimens in, or a house plant in, for example. You really need something that's kind of deep and kind of wide and broad across. And then, of course, you know, a lot of us have pots like that too, and maybe we keep those out in front of the front door or something like that, or whatnot. And I'll talk about that in just a minute too. So you want something wide, you want something deep. I've already filled the bottom of this with about 8 inches of potting soil. You can see me digging down in there to kind of find the bottom. You know, I would recommend that you build a potting media that's fairly dry, or excuse me, well draining. You don't want to use garden soil. You want to really get a potting mix that you could buy from the garden center or the farm store. You can mix some pieces of gravel in the media that you put here in the bottom, just to ensure a little extra drainage. It's not totally required. Obviously, the bigger the pot that you get, it's sometimes nice not to have to carry around that whole soil volume. And so sometimes people put things in the bottom, and you know, you don't have to do that, but it certainly, if you want to reduce the weight of the pot, it certainly does save in putting all of the soil, all that volume to soil. You have something a little lighter at the bottom that can kind of break that up. Some people use terracotta shards or little broken pieces of things to put in the bottom there, and that works just fine. So I filled this up about 8 inches with soil. And one of the things when you're planting in a pot, particularly with tulips, is you really can ignore all spacing recommendations that you would outside. When you get tulips from us in this next week, you know, there'll be some numbers and some little charts and nice helpful tips about how to space them out if you kind of want a recommendation for that. I already kind of told you kind of a general measure for depth. But spacing is important in the garden maybe a little bit because you probably have other plants around it. And so you want to kind of give everything a little bit of space to kind of come into its voids. In a pot, we don't care about any of that because we're probably going to just toss them anyway after this is all done. So I only have 10, well, I've got more. I'm going to just put as many in here as I possibly can. I kind of tilled this up so I want you to be able to see the bulbs in there a little bit and kind of an even level. And I'm putting them kind of just in a ring here for the purposes of demonstration, probably no more than about an inch apart. You could really put them touching, base to base. I want to see if I can make it all the way around the ring here with the 10 or so Angelique tulips that I have. And just so we're measuring, this looks to be about right up to the lip of the pot, because you wouldn't fill this, exactly to the brim. You'd leave a little lip, right, for watering. Right up to the lip of the pot is just sitting at about 9 inches. That might be just a bit deep. I could have had a little more soil in there too. And I could probably fit in another 4 or 5 bulbs in that interior ring and really jam these up so we get a nice full like bucket of tulips in the spring when these start to flower. And that's really the effect that we're going for, right? That's what's so generous about tulips is that, you put them in and they bloom their heads off that first year and they look great. And in a container like this, to really create that kind of floral, bouquet and a pot effect is really something special. Now, here's why I like to do this. Not only is just this, this is literally as easy as it gets. We fill in with soil, we water deeply once, we're done. You think, where do I keep it over the winter? So you gotta bring it into the garage. You gotta bring it into the garage and then actually we're done. Because here in central Iowa, it gets way too cold, usually most winters. And this thing will become basically a mushy ice cube if you don't give it just a little protection. Now, if for some reason you were doing this in a place like northern Minnesota, that's maybe even a whole zone and a half colder than we are, you could actually wrap this again in burlap or maybe just an old blanket that you have and set it again in an unheated garage. Most of our garages, tend to kind of, especially if they're attached to our houses or a garden shed that's close to the house, we'll keep a differential between the outside air temperature, often about 10 degrees, sometimes more, it depends on your garage, and how it's insulated and how it's built. So it's just enough to make sure that these are well insulated and going to make it through the winter. You don't have to water them over the winter. In fact, you really just want to water them once through when you bring them in, and you're set. So I started to say the reason I like to do this is because if any of you have deer, and I'm sure all of you could raise your hand if we could see you, you could all say, oh, deer. And deer love tulips. You love tulips, I love tulips, deer love tulips more than both of us. And they can be just murderous in tulips in the garden. So much so that you'll never even see your efforts. So the nice thing about putting them in containers, you can keep them close to the house, not that that stops deer at my house, but you can put a little chicken wire over the top of this. You can even actually plant them with chicken wire. You can actually fill this up even almost to the top and then put like a chicken wire sort of cage over the top of it and fill the last few inches up so that they can't even dig around in there. Squirrels can sometimes be a bit of a pain in this way too. So at least in a container, it allows you to control the circumstances a little bit more so you can actually really get that beautiful, gorgeous tulip display that you see in your mind and that you're dreaming of, that you can actually achieve it maybe a little bit easier than you could in an open garden. And so in a container, you can just create these really spectacular and beautiful displays. If you wanted to, now you don't have to certainly do this, but it's certainly an option if you want to get creative. You can actually layer other bulbs in on top of this. So if you think about the garden, and you think about the bulbs like tulips and the daffodils that should be planted really deeply, you can think about like the crocuses and the snowdrops that could be planted at a shallower layer. And you can almost create this mixed bulb display in a container, starting with the deepest bulbs first down here at this level, and then just working your way up to the smaller bulbs that can come here at the top. So you can have a nice wave of early spring interest, of mid-spring interest, and then that late spring interest with the tulips. One thing I would say, regardless of whatever style or however you mix it up or whatever you do, if you are going to use tulips in particular, and you're going to kind of plan for maybe several colors or whatnot, if you're going to use multiple varieties of tulips, try not to do more than maybe 2 or 3, and be really generous about how many you put in each layer, because the idea is to create this just whoosh sort of effect. And if you start dividing that, times 1, 2, 3 layers, the effect isn't necessarily quite as strong if you're really only focusing on one type of bulb, i.e. like tulips. So that's a really easy, creative way to avoid some of the challenges of tulips in the ground in our climate, and to really be able to create beautiful displays that you can move around, you can style and decorate with almost, whether it's in front of your front door, on your patio, or your deck. You have this fairly inexpensive way of using fairly inexpensive bulbs to create something really, really spectacular and really beautiful. So that's a wrap on bulbs and pots. And for once in my life, I'm actually slightly ahead of schedule. And so, Heather, I might see if we have any questions at this point while I have everything spread out, and maybe folks are curious about bulbs in pots or bulbs in the garden or any of the particular species that we might be offering. And I'd love to have any kind of dialogue people would be interested in participating in relative to questions or curiosities they have.
Yeah, we have one question from Rita who's asking if a carport would be a good place to store something like this, or if it would be too cold.
Well, I suppose it depends on the carport, but it's important that wherever you decide to store these, you know, that they're staying just a little bit warmer than whatever the air temperature is outside. I know I have an attached garage at my house, and I've noticed that even on one side of the garage versus the other, obviously the side of the garage that attaches to the house is a much better wall to keep these on than even the side of the garage that's a little more exposed. So you want to certainly keep them protected, you know, out of the wind and those sorts of things, because you know any cold air that's moving against, particularly a fairly porous surface like terracotta, which is it's pretty light, really. I mean, it's pretty porous to temperature and to the elements. You want to make sure that's protected. Now, you could even go to the extra effort, Rita, perhaps in your carport, and take a piece of burlap and kind of wrap the outside just to give it a little extra protection. Whatever you do, assuming you're all watching in central Iowa here, do not leave these outside unexposed. In warmer parts of the country, you can do this and pull the pots up close to the house or the garage without having to bring them in. But in our part of the world, it just gets a little too cold most winters for us to do that. And I've experimented with that myself because I like to mess things up and learn from my mistakes and try and figure things out and why they didn't work. And I have not had a single bout of success leaving containers of a variety of different bulbs outside. And so the heavier the container, the better. A terracotta is fine, but you know there's obviously all kinds of different materials that you can buy containers. Ceramics and concrete and stone and whatnot. Stone works really well, actually, is maybe the best with limestone troughs or containers. Those are really, really good because they do insulate a lot more.
And Rita just asked, is a pot made of plastic okay?
Yes, actually it is. Many plastic pots work just fine for this, so long as it's a fairly thick plastic, not like a nursery plastic, but if it's like a more decorative plastic pot or a resin container, that's got some sort of oomph for it. It's kind of double layered. Those work just fine as well too, and they're lighter than certainly lugging something like this around too.
Great. Shirley has a question that I think is referring to a mixture that we have had at the garden.
Yes.
He asks, how do you add the grape hyacinth and angelique tulips in a pot at the gardens? Can this be put in the ground this fall?
Yes. Yes, it can be planted this fall. You really should plant those in the next month. That layering effect, again, is kind of just like we described. In a container, you'd put the tulips down here at the bottom, just like we have shown. And then right up about maybe 2 inches below the lip of the pot here is where you would put in the muscari. And then you'd finish filling the pot up to the top. Muscari can be planted quite shallowly, really only 2 or 3 inches deep. And then you would just water that all in, and it would really be that easy. Now in the garden, it's the same rule. Even in the same hole that you dig, you can dig a hole or dig out an area if you're going to plant them. Plant the tulips at the deepest part, 8 inches below that. Fill it up just until you're about 3 inches below the surface of the soil. Put in your layer of muscari, and then finish backfilling onto the top. And that kind of layer, even within the same planting hole, if you dig a fairly large space out, or even if you're digging one hole at a time, you can literally do that kind of, one on top of the other, layering, separated by really only a few inches of soil, and it works just fine.
Is there ever an issue of the lower bulb running into the upper bulb, or do they navigate around each other?
They pretty much have a way of navigating around each other, and certainly you can imagine. You look at like what we do here at the garden in the espalier wall, and the Belvedere is probably the other place where we do that the most, where we often will layer 1 or 2 or 3 different kinds of bulbs on top of the tulip display. And they just find a way sort of to do it. They kind of claim their niches and pick their lanes, and up they come, and here they go. Certainly, that level of density to create those displays is probably a little tighter than maybe what the information on the back of the bulb packets is going to tell you. So if you really wanted to create that kind of wowzer instant display, just keep tightening those densities up. And knowing that, that may not be something that comes back year after year after year, but that's kind of an annual display that you're creating and doing.
Great. And Rita has another question about the container bulbs. Do you add bone meal to the soil in a pot, or is that just for a regular garden?
You really, if you're going to grow bulbs in pots, you're kind of assuming that you're probably not going to keep them for more than a season at a time. The bone meal is totally superfluous. It's actually superfluous even when you plant them in the garden for the first year, because remember, all of these storage, there's all this stuff that this bulb is storing. It's already got its flower bulb for next year is already in there, and all of this tissue that's around it is already there to support that floral display. And in fact, it's really actually the following flowering season that's going to be made in your garden. So this bulb that you plant in 2020 that will flower in the spring of 2021 has everything it already needs. It's actually only putting down enough roots this fall to take in a little water, which activates a series of compounds inside the bulb that prevent it from freezing. It's like an antifreeze system. It just needs a little water to activate it, which is why you can plant bulbs in Iowa really up until the point that soil temperatures start to get into the kind of the low 40s, upper 30s, because they still just need to just get that little tiny root out of the base of here into the soil so they can suck up a little water and activate those compounds inside the bulb that make sure that they overwinter. Everything else is taken care of for the spring of 2021. Now, on this allium, for spring of 2022, it's working for the spring and summer and fall of 2021 underground in your garden to build that display up for the following spring. So that's really the point in which your soil's fertility is really going to inform the kind of result that you can expect to see in the following spring. So, I often do not use bone meal or additives at all, kind of ever. But certainly, if you're gardening in a soil that maybe you've had some challenges with, or you've had it tested, and there's been a recommendation to do that, you can certainly add bone meal at the time of planting, that will persist into the soil for some time and be available to that bulb the following year when it's trying to store up reserves for that spring 2022 flower.
Gotcha.
Great
Another
question.
good question. Do you put screen mesh over bulbs planted in the garden to prevent squirrels from messing with them?
Yes, a lot of people do that. I don't worry about that in my garden so much because the soil is just so darn heavy. The squirrels just mostly give up and go play around in somebody else's yard. But obviously, they are creatures that can dig around and root around, and they're not the only thing. There's voles and moles and gophers and all sorts of other small mammals that can do that kind of tunneling and rooting around in the garden. So if you do live in an area where you have populations of those animals that do cause you some headaches, you can, in fact, plant many of these bulbs in a situation where you put a layer of that chicken wire. You just want to make sure that the openings in that wire are really big enough, or really kind of comparable to the size of the bulbs, just as a reference, so that the leaves and every flowers and everything can kind of just push through them as they would, and then retreat, back through them, or senesce in the summer. So many people do that. There are some companies out there that even sell fancy little cages that you can plant things in. You don't have to really spend that money. You can just get a piece of chicken wire or hardware cloth from the hardware store, so long as it has big enough kind of openings to get the bulbs through. That's all you have to do. And you can really just kind of lay that inside the planting hole and then backfill on top of it, and it's really that easy.
Great. I was wondering, we were talking about pest control. The containers are a great way to protect your bulbs from deer. Are there deer-resistant bulbs that you could recommend?
Absolutely. Daffodils are, this is what, in fact, I feel sort of naked as a gardener here without daffodils around me, because that is my, daffodils are so bulletproof. There's nothing that eats daffodils. I mean, they just are not palatable to so many creatures. What's that?
Sorry, that was a radio.
Oh, And so, daffodils are, if you've got critters and you just are tired of the pain and the suffering and trying to grow great tulip displays, containers or not, daffodils are the way to go. And they are just super, super tough. Almost all varieties of daffodils have generally good perennial quality. Some are exceptional and some are, maybe just average. But the vast majority of daffodils are great perennial bulbs to keep around for decades, frankly. There are species of daffodils that have naturalized, in this country and then all over Europe where they're native, and they're really, important garden plants in so many great gardens around the world. So great choice if you have critters and you're just tired of beating your head against the wall.
Excellent. What do you suggest for preparing clay soil?
Well, so one of the things about, our approach to horticulture in general is, we try and match plants to place. And so, clay soil in particular, and coming from somebody who gardens on extremely heavy clay, just north of downtown by McHenry Park, there is almost no amount of amendment in the traditional sense that you can do to really heavy clay soil to, artificially that is, without just some time for allowing plants to do that naturally. That's going to improve it significantly to mean that you can suddenly plant A, B, and C after than before. There are bulbs that do really well in clay. Daffodils actually could care less. Most daffodils are quite tough in clay, and so you don't have to mend your soil at all. You just dig a hole, which is challenging enough, believe me. I'm like the human version of the vole going through my yard planting bulbs in the fall. It just looks like a war zone sometimes after I'm done because it's such an effort to dig up that clay soil. Camassia, the wild quamash, the beautiful blue panicles of blooms. We're selling some in the market if you haven't seen them. Native to the Pacific Northwest in wet meadows. Love clay soil. Aren't phased by it at all. I have a river of blue camassia through my prairie on the west side of my house that I've built and grown because they love clay. They do quite well in them, and they were really spectacular this spring. Snowflakes, leucosium, are another great bulb for clay. So in general, I always recommend trying to fit plants to place rather than trying to manipulate the place to grow, to grow a whole array of other things. Now, certainly, there are things you can do just as a sort of good gardening practice, the addition of organic matter, which if you're growing a really dense, lush garden and you're cutting it back and leaving a lot of those garden clippings, that's helping to build organic matter. So the real lesson with clay is just, you got to keep kind of pushing at it, kind of matching plants to place, and slowly over some years, that accumulation of more organic matter or that addition of organic matter through composts or leaf mulch or whatever will continue to improve that general drainage and condition of the soil. Remember, clays are actually very nutrient-rich soils. It's just that they lack some structure and some oxygen for roots to be able to move through them as effectively as they would in a tilthier soil, like a loam or a silt-based soil. So clays are not inherently bad. They're just difficult to work in sometimes and lead to just a little different kind of thinking about how to garden it.
Sounds like great character building.
Yeah, well, it's that too. And believe me, if you want to empathize, you want empathy and sympathy about clay gardens, you just email me because I'm making one right now. Over the last 3 years, there are days where it is indeed a character building exercise.
Yes. We had another really good question from Sean. He's wondering if you can talk about when you cut back the stems and leaves after they've all bloomed. What do you do when they're done?
Well, in the late spring and early summer, a lot of our spring flowering bulbs do indeed kind of go through the senescence and go into dormancy. It's really best to try and leave all of that as long as possible because remember, this is a storage unit. This has one chance every year to be spectacular. And so if you kind of interrupt that period of it needing to photosynthesize with sometimes those big ugly leaves, in the case of daffodils, big strands of leaves that hang around, they got to be there to do that work so that they can put energy here to make all that happen again the following year. So you got to leave that as long as you possibly can. When they start to get yellow, they're not photosynthesizing anymore. And so that's the point at which they can kind of be removed. Now, some people like to get in there and cut them up and, get them out of the way. And I garden in a very abundant context, a very ecologically plant community-driven context, and so I actually do none of that myself. I just sort of let the garden kind of, take over in their wake, and so I do very little of that. I will cut back. Camassia seed stalks aren't particularly attractive, and so once they've dried, I'll cut them out and remove them so they're not in the way of the rest of the garden throughout the summer. And I just compost that, and that's done. But that's really about it. I mean, there's not a whole lot of intervening you need to do until the point at which they're yellow and not there's leaves that come after the flowers so often are not green anymore. So when they're not green, their job is done. They're senescing. They're going into dormancy. They're taking their break until the next flowering season.
Makes sense. I had another question. As we were talking, you mentioned how difficult it can be to get a hole in the ground, especially when you've got other stuff planted around you. Do you have any recommendations for tools? I know there are bulb planting devices.
Yeah.
Are those?
That's a great question, Heather. I should have brought some equipment. We could have talked. That is a great. I just can't underscore enough how great of a question that is, because these days, if you're inclined to use power tools, there are so many nice bulb augers that are out there that really are just, they can be any length. There are some that are big enough that'll go onto a gas-powered, almost like a hedge trimmer sized engine. Now there are some, you can buy those as a whole set, even at Home Depot probably right now. There's others that you can use even with just a cordless drill. You just lock in like a drill bit, and then you just drill into the ground, and they come in different diameters oftentimes. Those work really well in lighter soils. They do not work well in heavy clay soils. It'll just lock up the drill, and you'll never really get the hole that you're hoping, and it's just more headache than it's worth. But if you do not have heavy clay soil and you have pretty reasonable, easy to dig in soil, the drill bit sort of idea, or the bulb auger approach, is actually quite effective, and it saves your arms and your back and all those kinds of things. It's a great couples activity. Somebody drills and somebody drops. It's sort of like the dig, drop, and done kind of approach that the Netherlands Bulb Center trademarked many years ago. It's like somebody's doing the drilling, somebody's doing the dropping and kicking the hole over, and you can do hundreds in a pretty swift amount of time with that approach. So if you're not power tool inclined, and I'm not one of those people. Power tools are often a conundrum to me. Because I have no talent for that. I actually prefer, it's one of the tools I use all through the gardening season. Maybe someday we should sell them. We should get an arrangement to work them out. You can buy them online now from several places. There's a Dutch brand called Schneeboer, and it's a long-standing company that's designed beautiful gardening tools for many years. They have beautiful bulb spades and perennial spades. I garden all year long with a 24-inch, 22-inch, I think technically, perennial spade that digs beautiful holes for anything up to 1 gallon in size. It's great for bulb planting because the blade is almost kind of heart-shaped. It's really only about that big. It's very sharp with a pointed end, and within a couple of really good passes, even in heavy clay soil, you can have a pretty substantial hole kind of carved out into the ground. And it's great because, as Heather, I think you were alluding to, if you've got a perennial border full of all kinds of things, you don't want like a machine in there. You don't want to be tearing into all your other stuff. You want kind of the scalpel approach. You want to take a surgical approach to kind of just slipping those bulbs in. And littler devices like perennial or bulb spades, or even the bulb trowels that are much even much smaller than that, almost look like if you have seen Korean garden knives, the hori knives, their blades are only about like this. And so, sometimes they're kind of keeled and tapered so that they, again, slip into the soil very easily and kind of open up a pocket that you can drop a bulb into. The bigger the bulb gets, the less effective those smaller trowels are because they just don't make a big enough hole. So if you took my recommendation for Camassia, you would definitely need a bigger spade to get those in the ground because Camassias are the size of small rutabagas. I mean, they're huge, and they do require a pretty substantial hole at about 8 inches deep to get down to appropriate depth. But again, that follows back to that tip we talked about earlier. 3 inches, 3 times the depth equals, or 3 times the width equals the depth at which they should be planted.
Very nice. Well, we're actually right at 1 o'clock.
Wow, that's great questions. Yeah. People are excited. I can tell. These are very cute, very thoughtful. questions. It's been a pleasure to be able to talk with you all today about bulbs. And please reach out to us if you've got questions about bulbs you see on the fall bulb and perennial market. And I don't know if we said, Heather, you can find that at dmbotanicalgarden.com, and you go up at the top and click shop. It'll take you right to that page. So reach out to us if you have questions. And even if you're up picking bulbs up next weekend, we'll be around, and certainly we'll try and help you in any way we can.
Absolutely. And keep an eye on your inboxes. I'll be sharing this recording and any other things that we can think of to throw in there. And you'll have access to Kelly's email too. And he's a great person to email with questions. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for your fabulous questions. We hope to be seeing you at another class very soon.
Happy gardening.
Bye.